Life in America's Old West. Cowboys, settlers, and more. Hey yo, boring history for sleep. Hey there. Tonight we're stepping away from the bright lights of modern life and drifting slowly back into a world that smells of dust and wood smoke and the long, low wind that comes off an open plain with nothing in its way for 500 miles. Not the glossy Hollywood version with its dramatic gunfights staged conveniently in golden afternoon light. Not the version where every sheriff has a square jaw and every outlaw has a sneer, and somebody always rides off into a sunset that is just a little too perfect. We're going somewhere quieter and stranger and more real than that. Somewhere that was genuinely extraordinary and genuinely brutal, often in the same afternoon. If these slow journeys through the past help you unwind, help you drift, help you lay your phone down and let your shoulders soften, then please consider liking and subscribing, only if it truly helps your mind settle. And if you'd like to support this peaceful little corner of history, your encouragement means more than you might imagine. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is there, and whether you've already turned the lights down. It's oddly comforting to know who else is letting history carry them gently off to sleep. Now, dim things down, let your breathing slow, and let's begin. The American Old West. The very phrase carries a particular weight, doesn't it? It conjures something enormous and wide and unfinished. It suggests a world that was still being figured out, still being named and mapped and argued over, where the rules were loose and the horizons were real. And that, in its quiet way, is exactly what it was. The period historians most commonly call the Old West stretches roughly from the end of the American Civil War in 1865 through to about 1895 or so, though the edges are blurry and the debate about where it begins and ends is itself part of the story. 30 years, a single human generation, long enough to build an entire mythology, not long enough for most of the people living through it to appreciate what they were part of. They were too busy surviving. The geography of this world was staggering in its scale. West of the Mississippi River, the landscape opened up into something that people from the eastern seaboard of the United States had genuinely never encountered before. The Great Plains, stretching from the Missouri River to the Rocky Mountains, and from Canada down into Texas, were so vast and so flat and so treeless that early explorers called the whole region the Great American Desert. Not because it lacked grass, because it had enormous amounts of grass, but because it lacked the familiar, comforting density of eastern forests, the creeks and woodlots and hedgerows that made land feel knowable. The plains felt unknowable. They felt like standing at the edge of something that simply did not stop. Beyond the plains lay the Rockies, and beyond the Rockies the high desert country of Nevada and Utah and Arizona, and further still the green valleys of Oregon and California, and the dry, spectacular canyon country of the Southwest. It was all there, waiting, enormous, and largely unmapped by the people who were about to arrive in their wagons and their boots and their ambitions. What we're going to do tonight is walk through that world together, slowly and carefully. We'll meet the cowboys and understand what their lives were really like when the songs weren't playing. We'll travel with the great cattle drives north across 1,000 miles of open country. We'll sit with the homesteaders in their sod houses and feel the weight of the wind. We'll walk the muddy main streets of frontier towns and push through the saloon doors and hear what was actually happening inside. We'll hear the stories of the women who held this whole fragile world together without much credit. We'll reckon with the Native Americans whose land this was and what happened to them. We'll meet the outlaws and the lawmen, the legends and the ordinary souls who vanished without fanfare. We'll feel the ground shake as the railroad arrived and changed everything. And we'll stay until the end, until the Old West began to slip into myth, until the last cattle drives wound down and the barbed wire went up, and the newspapers started writing about this period in the past tense. It will all take some time, and that's rather the point. So, settle in. We're going west. Before the cattle drives and the homesteaders and the outlaws, before any of the human drama that we associate with the Old West, there was simply the land. And the land was extraordinary in ways that are difficult to overstate and easy to underestimate if you've only ever seen it on a screen. Let's try to see it properly. Stand on the eastern edge of the Great Plains in the 1860s and look west. You are standing at a point where the familiar rolling, wooded hills of Missouri or Iowa or Illinois flatten out, almost imperceptibly at first, and then more decisively, opening up into a vastness that the human eye is genuinely not well equipped to process. There are no landmarks. There are no trees except along the narrow corridors of rivers where cottonwoods and willows crowd the banks and provide the only vertical lines for miles in any direction. Everything else is horizontal. The sky is enormous, so enormous that you notice weather forming in the distance and watch it approach for an hour before it arrives. You can see thunderheads building in the west, purple and green and massive, and they look close, but they are 60 miles away. Distance behaves differently here. The prairie plays tricks. The grass itself is remarkable. Before the settlers ploughed it under, the Great Plains were covered in grasses that in many places grew tall enough to swallow a horse's belly. The big blue stem and the switchgrass and the Indian grass of the tall grass prairie farther east, giving way to shorter buffalo grass and grama grass as you moved west and the rainfall dropped. The grass was not just scenery. It was the foundation of an entire ecosystem. It fed the bison, the enormous herds of American buffalo that once ranged across the plains in numbers that still strain belief. Estimates vary, but before the great slaughter of the 1870s, somewhere between 30 and 60 million bison roamed North America, with the vast majority on the plains. When a herd was moving, the ground trembled. The sound could be heard from miles away. The plains turned brown and black as far as you could see in any direction, not with soil, but with living, moving animals. The weather on the Great Plains was its own kind of character. Summers were genuinely brutal. The sun came down with an intensity that bleached everything, that cracked lips and parched throats and turned rivers into muddy trickles by July. Temperatures on the southern plains in summer regularly reached well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind, which was nearly constant, offered no real relief because the wind was hot. It was like standing in front of an oven with the door open. Prairie fires were another summer terror. Sparked by lightning or by careless campfires, or sometimes deliberately set, fires could race across the dry grass at the speed of a galloping horse, moving faster than any person on foot could possibly run, consuming everything in their path and leaving behind a black, smoking emptiness. Homesteaders who survived them described walls of orange flame stretching for miles across the horizon, the smoke visible for half a day before the fire arrived. And then there was winter. The Great Plains invented a particular kind of winter. Blizzards could arrive with almost no warning, the temperature dropping 40 or 50 degrees in a matter of hours as the Arctic air funneled south with nothing to stop it. The blizzard of January 1888, known afterward as the school children's blizzard because of the terrible number of children who died trying to walk home from school, struck on a morning that had begun unusually warm. People were outside in shirt sleeves. By afternoon, the temperature had fallen to -40 in some areas, and the visibility was 0. The snow came sideways. People died less than 100 feet from their own front doors, unable to find their way through the white blindness. It was not a gentle world. The land gave enormous things, the space and the grass and the wildlife and the possibility of a new beginning, but it exacted a price for all of it, and the price was paid in full, regularly, often without mercy. The landscape changed dramatically as you moved west and south. The high desert country of New Mexico and Arizona was a different kind of harsh. A dry, stony, sun-hammered world of mesas and canyons and arroyos that ran with brown water when the rare rain came, and were bone dry the rest of the time. The sky there was a brilliant, almost violent blue, and the rocks were red and orange and a pale buff-coloured cream, and the scrub-covered hills looked close but were always farther than they appeared. A person who got lost in the desert in summer without water could die within a day. The mountains of Colorado and Wyoming were different again, green with pine forest below the tree line, then bare and rocky and sheathed in snow for much of the year above it, with passes that were blocked by snowfall from October to June, and traversed by thin, winding trails that a mule could manage, but a wagon could only barely attempt. This was the world. This was the stage. And onto it came, in waves and trickles and sudden floods, the people whose stories we are here to tell. Not one kind of people, but many, with different reasons for coming and different ideas about what they were entitled to find when they arrived. Understanding the land is the beginning of understanding all of it, because the land shaped everything that happened on it. It shaped the routes the cattle drives took, following the rivers to avoid the worst of the dry stretches. It shaped the sod houses the homesteaders built, because there was no timber for 100 miles. It shaped the entire culture of the cowboy, whose skills and clothing and habits were direct responses to the specific challenges of moving animals across this particular unforgiving terrain. The land was not background. The land was the whole story, really. Let's talk about the cowboy, the real one, not the one in the movies, because the real one is in some ways more interesting, and in other ways considerably less glamorous than the version that became embedded in American mythology. And in some ways he is both of those things at once, which is where the most honest histories tend to live. The cowboy, as an institution, did not spring fully formed from the American imagination. He was born, more accurately, from the Mexican vaquero tradition, the skilled horseman who had been managing cattle on the rangelands of Mexico and what is now Texas since the Spanish brought both cattle and horses to the Americas in the 16th century. By 1519, Spanish ranchers in colonial Mexico were already employing indigenous riders, the original vaqueros, to tend their herds. These men developed the techniques, the terminology, the gear, and the fundamental culture of cattle handling on horseback that American cowboys would later adopt almost wholesale. The words tell the story. Bronco, from the Spanish for rough or wild. Lasso, from lasso. Chaps, shortened from chaparreras. Corral, rodeo, remuda, wrangler. All of these arrived in English via Spanish, because the knowledge arrived the same way. When Anglo-American settlers flooded into Texas in the early 19th century, they learned from the vaqueros already there, adapted what they learned, and called the result their own. That is the actual origin story. The great age of the American cowboy, as we know it, the era of the cattle drives and the cow towns and the open range, lasted roughly from 1866 to about 1886. 20 years. Not long. Historians estimate that between 12,000 and 40,000 men worked as cowboys during this period, depending on how loosely you define the term and what time within those 2 decades you're measuring. Perhaps a quarter of them were African American. Another 15% or so were of Mexican descent. Some were Native American. The popular culture image of the cowboy as uniformly white, uniformly Anglo, and uniformly heroic was a later invention, a carefully maintained fiction that served various cultural purposes and erased the contributions of the men who were arguably the most skilled and experienced in the entire workforce. Who became a cowboy? Mostly young men, and often very young men, some starting as early as 12 or 13, drawn by a combination of economic necessity and the genuine appeal of an outdoor life with a clear purpose and a hierarchy they could understand. After the Civil War, Texas was awash in both cattle and unemployed men. Many former Confederate soldiers came home to find their farms ruined, their savings worthless, and their futures uncertain. The cattle that had been breeding unchecked while the ranchers fought could be rounded up and driven north, where beef fetched real money. Working a cattle drive paid around $30 a month, which was not generous even by the standards of the time, but it was regular, and it included meals, and it had the undeniable appeal of motion, of being on the move through a landscape that was still largely wild. The cowboy's daily life began before the sun, long before. On a working ranch or a cattle drive, the cook, often the most respected and most reliably well-paid member of the outfit, had the fire going and the coffee on an hour or more before dawn. And the smell of that coffee, strong and black and slightly singed from the open flame, was the alarm clock for everyone else. Breakfast was simple. Biscuits made in a Dutch oven, bacon or salt pork, maybe beans from the night before, and coffee drunk in quantity. After breakfast there was no lingering. The horses needed attention. Livestock needed checking. The day's work needed to begin. The cowboy's clothing was not fashion. It was engineering. His broad-brimmed hat, what we now call the cowboy hat, had a specific and practical purpose. The wide brim shielded the eyes and face from a sun that, on the southern plains in July, could literally blind a man looking in the wrong direction. The high crown trapped air and provided modest insulation from the heat. When there was no water, the hat could be used to carry water to a horse. When there was no pillow, it served as one. Bandanas, worn around the neck and pulled up over the nose and mouth, were essential protection against the clouds of dust that a moving herd threw up in enormous quantities. Breathing at the back of a herd without that protection, riding drag as they called it, meant breathing a mixture of dust and dried manure for hours at a time. The chaps, those leather leg coverings that look theatrical to modern eyes, were armour against the mesquite and catclaw and Spanish dagger cactus that grew along the roots, plants with thorns sharp enough and long enough to open a man's leg to the bone if he rode through them unprotected. Cowboy boots had pointed toes not for style, but for function. the narrow toe slipping quickly into and out of a stirrup that could otherwise trap a foot during a fall, with consequences that ranged from painful to fatal. All of it, every single element of the cowboy's kit, was a solution to a specific problem posed by this specific landscape. The hierarchy on a working cattle outfit was rigid and clearly understood. At the top was the trail boss, the equivalent of a ship's captain, responsible for every decision, from route selection to river crossings to how long to push the herd each day. His word was final. Below him were the point riders, who rode at the front of the herd on either side and guided the leaders. The swing riders worked the flanks, keeping the herd's sides in line. At the back, eating the worst of the dust and doing the most thankless work, were the drag riders, who kept the stragglers moving, the weak and the tired and the young calves who could not keep up. The horse wrangler, often the youngest member of the crew, managed the remuda, the string of spare horses that each cowboy rotated through to keep from exhausting any single animal. A cowboy on a long drive might go through 5 or 6 horses in a single day. The cook ran the chuck wagon, which was not merely a kitchen on wheels, but the supply depot, the medicine chest, the post office, and the gathering place for the entire outfit. Charles Goodnight, the legendary Texas cattleman and trail boss, is generally credited with inventing the chuck wagon in 1866. It was, and remains, one of the genuinely practical innovations of the era. The pay, as mentioned, was around $30 a month, sometimes a little more for skilled riders or those in positions of particular responsibility. It was paid at the end of the drive, not along the way, which meant that a cowboy could work for 3 months and collect nothing until the herd arrived at the railhead. If the drive failed, if the cattle were lost to a stampede or a river crossing or a disease, the pay could disappear too. This was not a life of financial security. It was a life of physical labour, outdoor exposure, irregular sleep, simple food, and an almost total absence of the comforts that people in eastern cities were beginning to take for granted. There was very little romance in it on a day-to-day basis, and yet men returned to it season after season, because the alternative was the grinding poverty of sharecropping or factory work, and because there was something about the open land and the motion and the company of men doing difficult things together that satisfied something in them that other kinds of work did not reach. The physical reality of the cowboy's body after a season on the range was not something the dime novels ever described. Constant exposure to sun and wind aged skin rapidly, so that a man of 25 could look 40. Saddle work produced chronic problems with the lower back, the knees and the hips that accumulated over years of riding and never fully healed. Falls from horses were common enough that almost every experienced cowboy carried the evidence of them in poorly set broken bones and the specific grinding ache of joints that had absorbed more impact than they were ever meant to. Snakebite was a genuine hazard on the plains and the desert country of the southwest, where rattlesnakes were both abundant and camouflaged in ways that made surprise encounters entirely routine. The standard treatment for snakebite involved cutting the wound and attempting to suck out the venom, a method that was of limited medical value but was performed with conviction, often followed by the application of whatever the cook had on the wagon that seemed like it might help. The relationship between a cowboy and his horse was the most important professional relationship in his life, and it was genuinely complex. A good horse was not just transportation, but a working partner, an animal trained to respond to subtle shifts of weight and pressure, to hold its ground when a rope went taut, to move cattle with an intelligence that seemed almost deliberate. Cowboys spoke of good cutting horses with a reverence usually reserved for people, describing the animal's instincts and judgment in terms that suggested they believed the horse understood the work as clearly as the man riding it. A bad horse, or an untrained one, was a liability and a danger. The process of breaking a young horse to saddle, called bronc riding in the somewhat optimistic vocabulary of the era, was violent and dangerous for both the horse and the rider, and the cowboys who were best at it were regarded as skilled professionals rather than simply brave men. The social world of the cowboy, constrained as it was to the crew of the outfit for months at a time, developed its own customs and its own codes. There was a rough democracy to trail life that cut across some of the hierarchies of the outside world. A black cowboy who was the best roper in the outfit might command genuine respect from white colleagues who would have refused to eat at the same table as him in a Kansas town. The work required trust, the kind of trust that only comes from depending on other people in dangerous situations, and that trust could override some of the prejudices that structured American society more broadly. Not always, not consistently. The racism of the broader culture did not disappear on the trail, but the specific conditions of the work created moments and relationships that were, within their narrow context, more egalitarian than almost anything available elsewhere in post-Civil War America to the men who fell outside the category of white and Anglo-Saxon. Evenings on the trail, when the herd had been settled and the night guard posted and the supper eaten, were quiet in a way that is difficult to fully imagine in a world of electric light and ambient noise. The fire burned low, the stars came out in their millions. The men talked, or didn't, played cards with whatever cards survived the weather, mended equipment, and waited for the exhaustion that came reliably after a day of physical labour to pull them down into sleep. Some read, those who could, passing novels and almanacs and worn-out newspapers around the crew until the pages fell apart from handling. Songs were sung, quietly, partly because loud noise in the vicinity of a resting herd was professionally inadvisable, and partly because the songs that belonged to this particular world, The work songs and the ballads that had been adapted from older traditions, or composed on the trail itself, suited the mood of the evenings precisely. They were melancholy and beautiful, and completely unsentimental about the life they described, which was perhaps the most honest thing about them. The economics that drove the cattle drives were startlingly simple, even if the logistics were not. In the years immediately following the Civil War, Texas had cattle in extraordinary abundance, possibly as many as 5 million head, many of them descendants of the hardy longhorns that had been ranging free and breeding freely while the men who might have sold them were away fighting. The longhorn was not a beautiful animal. It was angular and lean and suspicious, and capable of inflicting genuine damage with the horns that gave it its name, horn spreads of 4 to 8 feet being recorded on adult bulls. But it was tough in the way that only an animal shaped by centuries of fending for itself in a difficult landscape can be tough. It could walk great distances on poor grass and less water. It could swim a flooded river without panicking, most of the time. It arrived at the railhead thinner than it had started, but alive, which was more than could be said for the more refined breeds that some optimistic ranchers tried to drive north in those early years. The price differential between Texas and the northern markets was the engine that drove everything. In Texas, in the late 1860s, a grown longhorn steer could be purchased for $4 or $5. In Kansas City or Chicago, that same animal was worth $35 to $40, maybe $45 if the markets were running well. The arithmetic was blunt and compelling. The problem was getting the cattle from Texas to Kansas. The solution was to walk them there. Across more than 600 miles of open country, through river crossings and Indian territory and prairie and drought and storm, with a crew of 10 or 15 men and a chuck wagon and several hundred spare horses and roughly 2,500 head of cattle that had no particular interest in going where you wanted them to go. The main trails north became famous and are still remembered. The Chisholm Trail, named for the mixed-blood Cherokee trader Jesse Chisholm, who had used part of the route for his own trading wagon, was the great central corridor running from southern Texas north through Indian Territory and into Kansas, ending at the railhead at Abilene. Between 1867 and 1884, millions of cattle walked this trail. The Western Trail, sometimes called the Dodge City Trail, ran further west and delivered cattle to Dodge City, which by the early 1880s was calling itself the cowboy capital of the world, with some justification. The Goodnight Loving Trail, blazed by Charles Goodnight and his partner Oliver Loving in 1866, cut west through New Mexico and Colorado, supplying beef to army posts and the growing settlements of the mountain territories. Together, these routes formed the circulatory system of the cattle industry, the veins through which the West's most valuable commodity flowed north to the markets that wanted it. The drives typically began in spring, when the grass was coming up green and the rivers were not yet at their worst summer low. A herd would be assembled, branded, and counted, a process that took days and was far louder and dustier than it sounds. Then the trail boss would give the order, and the herd would begin to move. A well-managed herd covered 10 to 15 miles on a good day, less if the grass was poor or a river crossing was needed, or the cattle were restless from bad weather. Getting from southern Texas to Abilene took anywhere from 2 to 4 months, depending on conditions. Getting to Dodge City or further north could take longer. The dangers of the trail were varied and genuine. River crossings were among the most feared events of any drive. The Red River, the Canadian River, the Arkansas, the Cimarron, all of these crossings could become death traps if the water was running high after spring rains. Cattle that hit fast, deep water in a panic could turn back on themselves, creating a mass of thrashing animals that drowned by the dozens, while the cowboys rode into the current trying to turn the leaders. Cowboys themselves drowned in these crossings, dragged under by their horses, or swept away by currents they could not fight in 40 pounds of waterlogged clothing. The trail boss made the call about when and where to cross, and it was one of the most consequential judgments he had to make. Stampedes were the other great terror. They could be triggered by almost anything. A crack of lightning, a rattlesnake striking at a horse's nose in the dark, a strange smell, a piece of canvas flapping in the wind, the shadow of a coyote crossing the moonlight. A herd of 2,500 cattle deciding to run all in one direction, all at once, in the middle of the night, was a natural disaster on the move. The ground shook. The noise was a roar that obliterated everything else. Cowboys who were camped in the wrong place were trampled. Cowboys who tried to turn the herd rode in arcs alongside the leaders in the dark, firing pistols into the air, shouting, doing anything that might cause the animals at the front to turn gradually and bring the herd into a great milling circle where the energy could dissipate. It sometimes worked, sometimes it didn't. At night, the herd was kept calm by the practice of night herding. Cowboys riding slowly around the perimeter in 2-hour shifts, their voices low, sometimes humming or singing. The sound of a human voice in the dark, enough to keep the cattle from startling. The songs the cowboys sang were not always the cheerful, upbeat folk tunes that later generations associated with the campfire. They were often slow and melancholy, working songs designed to soothe 1,200 pounds of anxious beef, and the cowboys who were good at it were genuinely valuable to the outfit. The night herder sat on his horse in the dark and the cold, singing softly to animals that did not entirely trust him, under a sky full of stars that in those pre-electric nights were almost incomprehensibly bright, the Milky Way a solid band of light from one horizon to the other. The reality of building a farm on the Great Plains arrived quickly, and was educational in the way that only physical hardship can be. The first problem was shelter. The plains had no trees. This was not a rhetorical exaggeration, For hundreds of miles, in many directions, there was no timber for building. A family arriving on their claim in Kansas or Nebraska or Dakota Territory with a wagon and a team of horses and the intention to build a house had to reckon with the fact that there was nothing to build a house with except the ground itself. And so they built with the ground. Sod houses, called soddies or sod houses, were constructed by cutting the thick, grass-bound prairie turf into blocks roughly a foot wide and 3 feet long, and stacking them like bricks. The roots of the prairie grasses held the blocks together with a grip that was surprisingly strong, and the walls that resulted were genuinely excellent insulation, warm in winter and cool in summer, in a way that a wooden house would have struggled to match. But a sod house was also dark, with windows as small as its builders could manage because glass was expensive and hard to transport. It was low, its ceiling often only 6 or 7 feet above the earthen floor, and that ceiling was itself sod, which meant that when it rained, it continued to rain inside the house for several hours after it had stopped outside, the water working its way slowly down through the soil above and dripping in cold, muddy streams onto everything below. Snakes found their way through the walls, mice nested in the thatch above, insects of every description dropped from the ceiling into food, into beds, into children's hair. One homesteader wrote matter-of-factly that she had become so accustomed to the centipedes that fell from the ceiling that she no longer screamed when one landed on her face at night. She simply removed it and went back to sleep. The weather was a constant adversary. Prairie fires could arrive with the speed and ferocity described earlier, and for a family in a sod house with a garden and a barn and a few precious years of labour invested in their claim, a fire was a catastrophe. Blizzards came without enough warning to be properly prepared for, and a person caught in the open during a true Great Plains blizzard, with the temperature falling and the wind at 40 miles an hour and the snow coming horizontally, could lose all sense of direction within minutes. Farmers tethered ropes from their houses to their barns so they could find the barn and back without losing their way in 20 feet of flying white. Some still died. The summers brought drought and grasshoppers. In the mid-1870s, great swarms of Rocky Mountain locusts descended on Kansas and Nebraska and Dakota Territory in clouds so thick they darkened the sun and piled up on railroad tracks 6 inches deep, the trains slipping on the crushed bodies and losing traction on the grades. The locusts ate everything, not just the crops, but the wooden handles of tools, the leather harness, the curtains in the windows. Families who had worked for 3 years toward their first real harvest watched it disappear in an afternoon. And then there was the isolation, the silence of the plains, which could be profound and beautiful on a still morning, could become oppressive and maddening in winter, when a family was snowed in for weeks at a time, the nearest neighbour 5 miles away across a white and featureless landscape. Women, in particular, wrote with painful candour about the loneliness of homestead life, the absence of community and conversation and human contact that had sustained them in the places they had left. The Kansas plains in February,
one homesteader wrote to her sister back in Ohio, was so quiet that she could hear her own heartbeat, and she had started to worry that the sound was not ordinary. It was not a life that suited everyone. Many claims were abandoned. Many families packed up everything they still owned, which was sometimes less than what they had arrived with, and turned their wagon east, and did not look back.
But others stayed. Others endured the fires and the blizzards and the grasshoppers and the loneliness and the mud and the insects and the failed crops and the inadequate medicine and the deaths of children. And they built something. They built farms and towns and schools and churches and a culture of stubborn, self-sufficient resilience that became one of the defining characteristics of the rural American Midwest. The people who made it through were remarkable. They had to be. Before the railroad made westward travel relatively rapid, the primary route for settlers moving to the Pacific Northwest and California was the Oregon Trail, a roughly 2,000-mile overland route that began at Independence, Missouri, and wound through the Great Plains, across the Rocky Mountains via South Pass in Wyoming, and down into the green valleys of Oregon and California. Wagon trains using the trail began in earnest in the early 1840s and continued through the 1860s, with somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people making the journey in those decades. The trail became one of the great shared experiences of 19th century America, a common story of hardship and endurance and transformation that connected generations of ordinary people to a particular place and a particular kind of effort. The preparations for the Oregon Trail journey were extensive and anxious. Guidebooks and newspaper articles offered sometimes contradictory advice about what to bring and how much of it. And the wagons that set out from Independence were typically loaded with everything the family thought they would need for the 6-month journey and the first years of settlement. Barrels of flour and salt pork, dried beans and rice, coffee and sugar, farm tools and seed, bedding and clothing, cast-iron cookware, rifles and ammunition, and in many cases furniture and household goods that the owners found they could not bear to leave behind, but that were abandoned along the trail as the oxen tired and the miles accumulated and the weight became too much to carry forward. The first 100 miles of the trail were marked in peak years by a trail of discarded property. Rocking chairs and iron stoves and heavy trunks and even pianos sitting on the prairie in the sun as the wagon trains moved on without them. The wagon itself was not the broad, high-sided conveyance of movies. It was smaller and more practical, a farm wagon fitted with wooden bows that supported a canvas cover, about 10 feet long in the bed, and pulled by teams of oxen rather than horses, because oxen were stronger and more reliable over long distances, cheaper to purchase, and, if the worst came to the worst, edible. The inside of the wagon was dense and dark, packed with supplies and equipment, with a narrow space where children might sleep or a sick family member be laid down. Travelling adults generally walked beside the wagon rather than riding in it, because the rough, rutted trail made riding uncomfortable, and because the oxen needed every pound of weight reduced that could be managed.
The social organisation of the wagon train was a fascinating improvised democracy. Groups of families travelling together elected captains and made rules and adjudicated disputes and made collective decisions about routes and campsites and the pace of travel through a process of negotiation that had to balance the needs of dozens of individuals and families with wildly varying capacities and requirements. Arguments about whether to push on or rest, whether to take the southern fork or the northern, whether to help a family whose oxen had died or to prioritise the welfare of the rest of the train. These were real debates with real consequences, and the journals and memoirs that trail travellers left behind record them with a frankness that suggests the democracy of the trail was as messy and contentious as democracy generally is. The graves along the trail were its most enduring physical legacy. Cholera swept through wagon trains in epidemic waves, killing people within hours of their first symptoms, and the dead were buried beside the trail by fellow travellers who could not spare the time for elaborate ceremony. Estimates of the total deaths on the Oregon Trail in its decades of heavy use run to somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people, roughly one grave for every 100 yards of trail. They were young and old, men and women and children, people from every kind of background who had made the same gamble on the same chance and had simply run out of luck at the wrong moment. The trail was a shared ordeal, and the people who walked it and survived it and built the Pacific Northwest and California and the territories in between were shaped by it in ways that they carried for the rest of their lives.
While the homesteaders worked the land and the cowboys worked the cattle, the towns grew. They grew because of the cattle, mostly, the railheads that the drives were aimed at, and the commerce that followed the cowboys who arrived there with months of pay and a powerful desire to spend it. But they also grew because of the settlers and the miners and the freighters and all the other people streaming west who needed places to buy supplies and sleep and settle disputes. The frontier town was its own kind of world, and it is worth walking through it slowly. The cattle towns of the 1870s and 1880s followed a recognizable pattern. The railroad arrived first, which meant the stockyards arrived first, which meant the saloons and the brothels and the gambling houses arrived almost simultaneously, because those establishments understood the demographics of their customer base with great precision. The stockyards needed banks to handle the cattle money, and banks needed buildings, and buildings needed lumber, and lumber required a freight operation, and a freight operation needed warehouses and teamsters, and the teamsters needed feed stores for their animals and boarding houses for themselves, and everyone needed a general store and a blacksmith, and after enough time and enough people and enough children, a school and a church and a doctor, roughly in that order. Abilene, Kansas was the first great cattle town, transformed between 1867 and 1872 from a barely noticed collection of log huts into a boom town by the vision of a cattle entrepreneur named Joseph McCoy, who recognized that the Kansas Pacific Railway had created a perfect opportunity. McCoy built stockyards and a hotel and a bank, and aggressively promoted Abilene as the destination for Texas cattle drives. The Texas Cowboys, who arrived there after 3 months on the trail, found a town that was entirely oriented around extracting the money they had just owned, and many of them were grateful for the service.
Dodge City, 100 miles to the west, followed in the mid-1870s and surpassed Abilene in notoriety, if not entirely in size, earning a reputation for lawlessness that it wore with something approaching pride. By 1880, Dodge City was shipping more cattle than any other point in the country, and boasting, somewhat dubiously, of being the wildest town on the frontier.
The saloon was the physical centre of town life. This is not a romanticization. In a period before telegraph offices or town halls or community centres, the saloon was the place where information was exchanged, where deals were struck, where disputes were begun and sometimes resolved, where mail was held, where the only newspaper in 100 miles could be read. The interiors were not uniformly the polished mahogany and mirror splendour of movie sets. Many frontier saloons were simple plank-walled rooms with a plank bar and bottles on a shelf behind it, and a few tables and sawdust on the floor to manage the mud that walked in on every pair of boots. The better ones had actual furniture, possibly a piano, possibly a chandelier of some kind, certainly a mirror behind the bar, because mirrors were expensive and their presence signalled prosperity. Whiskey was the primary product. Beer existed, but required ice, which was expensive. The whiskey was frequently of uncertain quality and provenance, sometimes diluted with water and variously supplemented, and it was consumed in prodigious quantities by men who had been denied it for months. The general store was the other pillar of the frontier economy. Here was where a homesteader could obtain the supplies that life on the plains required, and the land itself did not provide. Flour and sugar and salt and coffee, needles and thread, lamp oil, gunpowder, patent medicines of questionable efficacy but great variety, seed for planting, nails and tools, bolts of cloth, and the dozens of other essentials that a self-sufficient farm could not actually produce itself. The general store operated on credit as often as on cash, running long accounts for farmers who expected to pay at harvest time, and the relationships between store owners and farming families were often long and complicated, and occasionally ruinous for one party or the other. When the harvest failed, as it so often did, those accounts could not be paid, and the store owner either absorbed the loss or pushed the family off their claim, neither outcome being particularly satisfying to anyone. Law enforcement in these early cattle towns was, to put it diplomatically, aspirational. The towns needed some mechanism for preventing the armed and recently paid cowboys from shooting each other and the local residents at a rate that would discourage future commerce. And the mechanism they settled on was the town marshal, a position that combined genuine courage, diplomatic skill, and a willingness to impose order by physical force into a job description that attracted a specific kind of person. The most famous of these men, Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok and Bat Masterson, were celebrated in their own time and became legends afterward. But the ordinary, day-to-day work of keeping order in a cattle town was less dramatic than legend suggests, mostly consisting of confiscating firearms from men who were too drunk to be trusted with them, breaking up fights, and persuading people to move disagreements from inside the saloon to outside the town limits, where the noise would bother fewer people. The doctor, where one existed, occupied a peculiar social role.
Frontier physicians were respected for their education and their willingness to be there, and feared for the treatments they were sometimes obliged to administer. Amputation was performed without reliable anesthesia in many cases. Wound care was limited by both knowledge and supplies. A doctor who arrived after a gunfight or a farming accident was doing what he could with what he had, and what he had was often not much. The relationship between a frontier community and its doctor, when it had was one of genuine dependency and genuine gratitude, the kind that comes from knowing that without this person the situation would be considerably worse. Many frontier doctors were people of extraordinary dedication, riding enormous distances in all weather to attend patients who could not come to them, keeping mental notes on the pharmaceuticals that actually helped and the ones that were reassuring theatre, doing the work because someone had to, and they happened to be the someone. The violence of the Old West, as measured by actual historical data rather than by films, was real, but considerably less pervasive than mythology holds. Most cowboys spent their time in cattle towns getting a bath, buying new clothes, eating food that was not dried beans, and playing cards. The majority departed without firing a weapon at anything except, occasionally, the open sky.
The Old West was, in the imagination of popular culture, overwhelmingly a male world. The women who appear in the classic westerns are either waiting in a kitchen for the hero to return, or are dangerous temptresses in saloon dresses. Neither of these is close to the reality, which was considerably more complex and considerably more interesting. The women who came west were as varied as the men. Pioneer wives and daughters who crossed the plains in wagon trains and settled on homestead claims, doing work that was as physically demanding as anything their husbands did, and that received roughly none of the literary attention. Women who ran businesses in frontier towns, boarding houses and laundries and millinery shops, enterprises that were desperately needed and frequently more financially successful than the cattle speculation or gold mining that attracted more newspaper coverage. Women who owned and managed cattle ranches, a category that surprised and sometimes discomfited Eastern observers, but was simply a practical necessity in a landscape where the work needed doing, regardless of who was available to do it. Women who were doctors and teachers and newspaper editors in places where any warm body with the necessary skills was welcome, regardless of their gender, at a time when the same women would have found those professions effectively closed to them in Boston or New York. The workload of a pioneer woman on a homestead claim was staggering. She was responsible for the domestic labour that kept the family alive, cooking 3 meals a day over a wood or buffalo chip fire, preserving food for the winter months when nothing grew, sewing and mending all the family's clothing, managing the milk cows and the chickens, tending the kitchen garden that provided the vegetables that kept the family from getting scurvy, hauling water from the well or the creek, doing the laundry by hand in water heated over the fire, managing the children, caring for the sick, and doing all of this in a space that was often 12 by 14 feet of low-ceilinged sod house, with no running water and no reliable heat, and no glass in the windows, and a roof that leaked. On top of this, during planting and harvest seasons, she was also walking in the fields alongside her husband, because the claim could not wait for anyone's strength or convenience. The isolation was a specific burden that fell disproportionately on women. A cowboy or a male farmer had, by the nature of his work, regular contact with other men. He rode to town, he worked alongside hired hands or neighbors during roundup or harvest, he went to the cattle market or the grain elevator. His wife stayed home, mostly, because someone had to, and because the cultural expectations of the period made leaving home a production that required justification. The letters that frontier women wrote back to their families in the East are full of a longing for female company, for conversation, for the ordinary social textures of life that the openness of the plains had eliminated. Some women broke under this loneliness. Some adapted to it in ways that changed them permanently. Some found that the social rigidities of the East, the codes about what women could do and say and own and decide, loosened considerably in a place where every pair of capable hands was valuable, regardless of whose they were. There were women who became famous on the frontier in ways that stepped entirely outside the expected patterns. Calamity Jane, whose real name was Martha Canary, was a frontierswoman who dressed in men's clothing, worked as a scout and a mule driver, and cultivated a persona of wild independence that made her one of the most written-about figures of the era. The details of her biography were cheerfully embellished by herself and by the dime novelists who found her irresistible, but the core of her story, a woman who refused to confine herself to the domestic roles available to her, and who survived on the frontier by being harder and more adaptable than most of the men around her, was genuinely real. Annie Oakley, the sharpshooter who toured with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, was a different kind of frontier woman, one who turned her exceptional skill with a rifle into a career that made her internationally famous and considerably wealthier than most cowboys would ever be. She performed for heads of state, including reportedly shooting a cigarette from the mouth of Crown Prince Wilhelm of Germany, which seems inadvisable, but is part of the record. The women who worked in saloons occupied a complicated social position that history has treated variously, often with more moral judgment than nuance. Some were dancing girls, whose work was essentially theatrical. Some were engaged in prostitution, an industry that was widespread and poorly regulated, and genuinely dangerous in the disease-prone, sometimes violent atmosphere of a cattle town. Many women in these positions had arrived in the West not by choice, but by circumstance, pushed there by poverty, by abandonment, by the limited options available to women without family support. They are part of the story of the Old West, as real as the ranchers and the cowboys and the lawmen, and their presence in the towns was as economically significant as any of the other businesses. Their humanity, which was often overlooked in their own time and has been reduced to caricature ever since, deserves acknowledgement. There is a version of the Old West story that treats the Native Americans who lived there as scenery, as obstacles, as a backdrop against which the settlers and the cowboys play out their dramas. That version is wrong in a way that matters, and we are not going to tell it. The story of the native peoples of the American West during this period is one of the central stories, not a footnote, and it is a story of catastrophic loss visited on people who had developed
complex, sophisticated cultures over thousands of years in the landscapes that were being claimed in the name of manifest destiny. Before the surge of American settlement, the Great Plains were home to a number of native nations whose ways of life were intimately tied to the land and to the enormous herds of bison that ranged across it. The Lakota Sioux, the Comanche, the Cheyenne, the Kiowa, the Arapaho, the Blackfoot. These nations and many others had adapted over centuries to the specific conditions of the plains, developing mobile, horse-based cultures that were extraordinarily effective in this environment. The horse, ironically, had been introduced to North America by the Spanish, and its adoption by the Plains tribes had transformed their societies, beginning in the 17th and 18th centuries. Mounted warriors and hunters could range across enormous territories, follow the bison herds wherever they went, and defend their lands with a mobility and a ferocity that had made the plains a genuinely difficult proposition for American expansion before the Civil War.
The bison was the foundation of everything for the Plains tribes. It was not merely food, though it was certainly that. Every part of the animal providing something the community needed. The meat for eating fresh and dried, the hide for clothing and shelter and blankets and moccasins, and the great round bull boats used on rivers. The bones for tools and toys and needles and ceremonial objects, the sinew for bowstrings and thread, the stomach for cooking vessels, the dung for fuel. The bison was woven into the spiritual as well as the material life of the Plains nations in ways that made the herds something far more than a food source. The great hunts, conducted in a highly organized and ceremonially significant manner, were moments of communal meaning, not just of economic production. And then the bison were killed. Not gradually, not through the normal attrition of a hunting culture, but in an organized slaughter of a scale that remains one of the most extraordinary acts of deliberate ecological destruction in human history. Hunters, many of them professionals, supplied with the breech-loading rifles that made rapid, long-range killing possible, moved onto the plains in the 1870s, targeting the hides, which were suddenly in enormous commercial demand for industrial belts and rugs and ropes. A single hunter could kill 50 or 100 bison in a day. The hides were taken and the carcasses left to rot on the plains in such quantities that bone collecting became a legitimate industry for years afterward. The bleached bones gathered by the trainload and shipped east to be ground into fertilizer. Between roughly 1870 and 1883, the Great Southern Herd and then the Great Northern Herd were reduced from tens of millions to near extinction. The animals that had sustained the plains cultures for generations were gone, deliberately, systematically, in the space of little more than a decade. The United States government was well aware of what the destruction of the bison meant for the native nations. General Philip Sheridan, who commanded the army on the plains, reportedly told the Texas legislature that the hide hunters deserved bronze medals because destroying the bison was destroying the commissary of the Indian, and with it any possibility of native resistance to American expansion. The extermination of the bison was not a side effect of economic activity. It was a weapon. The history of this period is dense with broken treaties and forced removals and military campaigns against native villages. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 had guaranteed the Lakota the Black Hills of South Dakota as part of the Great Sioux Reservation, a sacred landscape at the heart of Lakota spiritual life. 6 years later, George Armstrong Custer led a military expedition into the Black Hills and announced the discovery of gold. The gold rush that followed made the treaty irrelevant in the eyes of the government, if not in the eyes of the Lakota. The resulting conflict culminated in June 1876 at the Little Bighorn River in Montana, where Custer and approximately 260 of his men rode into a situation they had fatally underestimated. The combined forces of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, under the leadership of Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, destroyed Custer's command in a matter of hours. It was the most significant military defeat the army suffered in the Indian Wars, and it changed nothing in the long run. The government's response was simply to increase the military pressure until resistance was no longer possible. The final chapter of the conflict came at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota in December 1890, when soldiers of the 7th Cavalry killed somewhere between 250 and 300 Lakota men, women, and children, who were in the process of being disarmed and relocated to the Pine Ridge Reservation. The Wounded Knee Massacre, as it came to be known, is generally considered the last major military engagement of the Indian Wars. By this point, the surviving native nations had been confined to reservations, their way of life systematically dismantled, their children sent to boarding schools designed to erase their languages and their cultures. The land they had lived on for centuries had been redistributed. The bison were gone. The open plains were fenced. Everything had changed, and none of it had been asked for or consented to.
Jesse James is perhaps the most enduring of all the outlaw legends. Born in 1847 in Clay County, Missouri, James grew up in a slave-holding family in a border state that was deeply divided over the Civil War. As a teenager, he rode with Quantrill's Raiders, the Confederate guerrilla unit that became notorious for the massacre of the town of Lawrence, Kansas in 1863, in which more than 150 civilians were killed. The violence of that war shaped James and his brother Frank in ways that never really healed. After the war ended, Jesse refused to accept the verdict of Confederate defeat and channeled his rage and his formidable organizational abilities into crime. The James Younger Gang, which included his brother Frank and their cousins Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger, staged the first daylight bank robbery in American history in 1866 in Liberty, Missouri, and went on to rob banks and trains across Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, and beyond for more than 15 years. The mythology that grew up around Jesse James during his own lifetime was fueled largely by a Confederate sympathizing newspaper editor named John Newman Edwards, who framed James as a Robin Hood figure, a man driven to outlawry by the cruel oppression of Yankee banks and railroads. The Robin Hood myth was largely invented. There is little evidence that James gave any of his stolen money to the poor. But the story met a genuine emotional need in a defeated South that was looking for heroes and finding them in the places available.
James was killed on April 3rd, 1882, not in a gunfight, but by a bullet in the back of the head fired by Robert Ford, a young gang member who had made a deal with the governor of Missouri for the $10,000 reward. He was 34 years old. His death made the front page of newspapers across the country and prompted an outpouring of grief from people who had never met him and whose lives his activities had quite often made worse.
Billy the Kid, born Henry McCarty around 1859, possibly in New York City, reached the frontier through a childhood of displacement and poverty after his father died and his mother fell ill. His transition to violence began in 1877, when he shot a man who had been bullying him at a military post in Arizona. He was 17. In the years that followed, he became entangled in the Lincoln County War in New Mexico Territory, a violent conflict between competing cattle and mercantile interests that was essentially a business dispute conducted with firearms. Billy fought on the losing side, and the men he killed in that conflict made him a wanted man. He escaped from custody twice, the second time killing 2 guards in the process. Pat Garrett, a former acquaintance who had been elected sheriff of Lincoln County specifically to deal with the Billy the Kid problem, tracked him down and shot him at Fort Sumner, New Mexico, in July 1881. Billy was 21 years old, or thereabouts. The number of men he actually killed, which was the subject of enormous speculation even in his own time, was probably somewhere between 4 and 9, depending on how you count. The legend said 21, one for each year of his life. The legend, as usual, was better than the facts. Wyatt Earp occupies a different kind of place in the mythology, as a lawman rather than an outlaw, though the line between the two categories was murkier than the mythology suggests. Earp worked as a lawman in various Kansas cattle towns, including Wichita and Dodge City, before moving to the silver boom town of Tombstone, Arizona, in 1880. Tombstone in those years was a genuinely chaotic place, a mine town that had sprung up almost overnight and was producing enormous quantities of silver and an equally impressive quantity of violence. The event that has lodged itself permanently in American memory, the gunfight at the OK Corral on October 26, 1881, was not exactly what its name implies. It lasted about 30 seconds and took place not at the OK Corral itself, but in a narrow vacant lot nearby. Wyatt Earp and his brothers Virgil and Morgan, along with their ally Doc Holliday, a tubercular Georgia dentist turned gambler, who is one of the more genuinely unlikely characters of the entire era, confronted a group of cowboys known as the Cowboys, including Ike and Billy Clanton and Frank and Tom McClowry, over the matter of a local ordinance requiring the surrender of firearms within city limits. When the shooting stopped, Billy Clanton and the McClowry brothers were dead, and 3 of the Earp party were wounded. Whether this was a legitimate law enforcement action or a targeted killing of rivals depended entirely on which side of the dispute you were on, and the question was debated at the time with a passion that suggests it was not simple. Wild Bill Hickok was another of the genuine legends, a man whose reputation as a gunfighter
was based on documented reality rather than entirely on newspaper invention. Hickok was a deadly and accurate pistol shot who had demonstrated this quality in multiple confrontations before becoming famous for it. He worked as a scout, a Union spy during the Civil War, a lawman in various Kansas towns, and later as a performer in Wild West shows. His death in Deadwood, Dakota Territory, in August 1876, came not in a gunfight, but from behind, a shot fired by a drifter named Jack McCall while Hickok was playing poker. The cards in his hand at the time, aces and eights, became known permanently afterward as the dead man's hand. He was 39.
Also worth noting in the canon of Western outlaws is Butch Cassidy, born Robert Leroy Parker in 1866 in Utah Territory, who led the Wild Bunch Gang in a sustained campaign of bank and train robberies through the 1890s that made him one of the most wanted men in the West. Cassidy had a particular quality that distinguished him from many of his contemporaries, a genuine charisma and a talent for organisation that would have served him well in legitimate business if his choices had run differently. He was reportedly reluctant to use unnecessary violence, preferred to achieve robberies by surprise rather than by gunfight when possible, and was genuinely liked by many who knew him, including ranchers who found his company agreeable, and his crimes, directed as they were largely at railroads and financial institutions, difficult to feel deeply aggrieved about. He and his associate Harry Longabaugh, better known as the Sundance Kid, eventually fled to South America in 1901 to escape the increasingly effective pursuit of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, hired by the railroads to put a definitive end to the Wild Bunch. Their ultimate fates remain somewhat unclear in the historical record, which has only deepened the legend. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency itself deserves mention in any honest accounting of the Old West, because it represented something new and consequential: private law enforcement, hired by corporations, operating across state lines and beyond the boundaries of local jurisdictions. Their pursuit of Jesse James in the early 1870s included a raid on the James family farm in Missouri, in which a bomb thrown through the window killed James's young half-brother and blew off his mother's arm. James was not present. The raid produced enormous bad publicity for the agency and genuine public sympathy for James in Missouri, demonstrating that the line between law enforcement and vigilante violence was not always clearly drawn, and that the institutions meant to bring order to the frontier were themselves capable of considerable disorder. What all of these figures share, beyond the violence that ended or defined their careers, is the way they were shaped by the specific conditions of the West in this specific period. The institutions of civil society, the courts and the banks and the police forces and the social safety nets, were either absent or so new and fragile that they provided little real protection. In that environment, personal violence was both a more available and a more consequential tool than it would have been in a more established society. The men who used it most effectively, in either its legal or illegal forms, became figures of enormous power and fascination. That they were also, in many cases, men of complicated morality and questionable methods was simply part of the reality that the myth later edited out. The outlaws of the Old West
came disproportionately from the ranks of the defeated and the displaced, Confederate veterans who refused to accept the post-war order, men pushed to the margins by poverty and by the specific economic arrangements of an unfinished society. This does not excuse the harm they caused, but it does explain why so many of them attracted the sympathies of populations that had their own reasons to distrust banks and railroads and the legal apparatus that served them. They were complicated people in a complicated time, which is precisely what makes them still worth thinking about. There is a moment that encapsulates the transformation of the American West better than almost any other. On May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah Territory, a golden spike was driven into a railroad tie, joining the Central Pacific Railroad, which had been built east from Sacramento by tens of thousands of Chinese laborers, and the Union Pacific Railroad, which had been built west from Omaha by Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans and anyone else who could swing a hammer. The transcontinental railroad was complete. The continent was connected from ocean to ocean by iron rails. The world, quite literally, was never the same again.
The railroad changed the American West in ways that were both obvious and subtle, immediate and long-lasting. The most obvious change was the compression of distance. Before the railroad, the journey from the Missouri River to California took 4 to 6 months by wagon, was grueling and dangerous, and was an experience that permanently altered anyone who survived it. After the railroad, the same journey took about a week and could be accomplished in reasonable comfort while reading a newspaper and eating meals in a dining car. This was not a minor improvement in travel time. It was a categorical change in the relationship between the eastern United States and the vast territories west of the Mississippi. For the cattle industry specifically, the railroad was the technology that made the whole enterprise possible, and later the technology that made it obsolete. The great cattle trails to Abilene and Dodge City were only necessary because the railroad had not yet reached Texas. Every mile the railroad extended southward shortened the required cattle drive and eventually eliminated it entirely. By the mid-1880s, railroads were reaching into Texas itself, and a cattle rancher could load his animals directly onto rail cars, rather than walking them 800 miles to Kansas. The romance of the long trail drive, such as it was, evaporated quickly when a more efficient alternative arrived. The railroad also transformed settlement patterns in ways that no earlier development had. Where the railroad went, towns sprung up, not organically, not in the way that towns had traditionally grown around natural features like rivers and crossroads, but deliberately, the railroad companies often owning the land on either side of the tracks and selling it in lots to settlers and businesses. The railroads needed customers, and they aggressively recruited them, sending agents to Europe to sell the promise of cheap Western land to German and Scandinavian farmers, printing advertising in multiple languages, running reduced fare promotional campaigns for potential settlers. The result was the rapid filling of the Great Plains with farming families who might never have heard of Kansas or Nebraska otherwise, arriving by the trainload with their tools and their seed and their ambitions, stepping off into a landscape that was beautiful and enormous and entirely unlike anything they had known before. The railroad workers who built the transcontinental lines were among the most diverse and hard-working labor forces in American history, and also among the most exploited. The Central Pacific's workforce was somewhere between 80 and 90% Chinese, men who had come to California during the gold rush and found themselves doing the most dangerous and demanding work of the entire enterprise, drilling through the Sierra Nevada mountains in winter, descending on rope swings to drill holes in rock faces for the explosives that would blast new right-of-way through solid granite. They were paid less than their Irish counterparts on the Union Pacific side, given no company housing, and largely erased from the official celebrations when the two lines finally met. The monument at Promontory Summit, depicting the executives and officials who drove the ceremonial spikes, contained no Chinese workers. The photograph, one of the most famous in American history, contained no Chinese workers. The men who had done the hardest work were invisible in the record of their own achievement. The railroad brought not just settlers and cattle and commerce to the West. It brought a particular kind of acceleration. Towns that were nothing before the railroad arrived could become substantial commercial centers in a year or two. Towns that the railroad bypassed withered with equal speed. Boom and bust became the characteristic rhythm of Western economic life, a rhythm that the railroad did not invent, but certainly amplified. The boom towns of the mining era, the silver bonanzas and gold rushes that drew thousands of people to Nevada and Colorado and the Black Hills, were made possible by the railroad's ability to supply them and then to carry away what they produced. There is a certain domesticity to the history of the Old West that gets lost beneath the drama of gunfights and cattle drives, a quiet, persistent daily reality of keeping people fed and more or less healthy in conditions that were not particularly well suited to either goal. Let's spend some time there, in the kitchens and the general stores and the occasional doctor's offices of the frontier, because it is there that the true texture of daily life is found.
Food on the frontier was practical, seasonal, and often monotonous. The staples of the homesteader's diet were bread, beans, salt pork or bacon, and whatever the garden could produce in season. Cornbread and biscuits, leavened with baking soda and made with lard, were the foundation of most meals. Dried beans, cooked long and slow with a piece of salt pork and seasoned with whatever was available, appeared on tables with a frequency that eventually inspired dark humour rather than genuine complaint. Coffee was consumed in enormous quantities, strong and unsweetened, and treated with a seriousness that suggests it performed important psychological functions as well as caffeinated ones. A settler who ran out of coffee was in genuine distress. Substitutes were tried: roasted grain, chicory root, dried sweet potato. They were tolerated, but not accepted. The conditions under which this food was prepared were difficult by any modern standard. Cooking over a wood fire or a dried buffalo chip fire required constant attention and considerable skill. The heat was uneven, the fuel variable, and the results often unpredictable, until a cook had learned the specific behaviour of their particular stove, if they were lucky enough to have a cast iron stove, or their particular fire, if they were not.
Women on homestead claims often cooked extraordinary meals under conditions that would defeat a professional chef, producing bread and preserves and cured meats and stews from raw materials and from scratch, with no refrigeration, no running water, and no cookbook more current than whatever their mother had written down for them before the wagon left. Meat was preserved by smoking, salting, or drying, since refrigeration did not exist in most of the West until the late 1880s, and even then was available only in the larger towns that had ice supplies. Wild game supplemented the domestic animals. Venison and antelope and rabbit and prairie chicken were all taken and eaten by both settlers and cowboys, adding variety and protein to a diet that otherwise leaned heavily on preserved foods. During good times, a family with a productive kitchen garden and some livestock and access to game could eat quite well by the standards of the era. During bad times, during drought years or grasshopper years, or the brutal winters when nothing moved and nothing grew and the stores were nearly depleted, hunger was a real and present threat.
Medicine on the frontier was a subject that encompassed everything from genuine skill to spectacular quackery, with considerable overlap between the categories. Actual trained physicians were rare in frontier communities, and those who existed often had training that was, by the standards of even the era, incomplete. The germ theory of disease, while advanced by Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch in the 1860s and 1870s, had not yet fully penetrated American medical practice, which meant that many doctors were still operating according to theories of illness that were wrong in fundamental ways. Surgery was performed without reliable anesthesia beyond whiskey in many frontier settings. Wounds were dressed with whatever was available. Infection, which we now understand to be caused by bacteria and which we can now treat with antibiotics, killed enormous numbers of people from injuries that would be trivial today. The patent medicines that filled the shelves of every general store and were sold from the wagons of travelling vendors offered a bewildering array of products, promising cures for everything from rheumatism to consumption to the various vague conditions that fell under the heading of female complaints. Many of these medicines contained significant quantities of alcohol, opium, cocaine, or some combination of the above, which meant that while they did not necessarily cure anything, they did reliably produce a feeling of improved well-being in the short term. Laudanum, which was opium dissolved in alcohol, was sold openly and used widely for pain, for anxiety, for helping children sleep, and for the coughs of tuberculosis patients, who benefited from the sedative properties, if not from any curative ones. The dental situation on the frontier was, if possible, worse than the medical one. A toothache on a homestead claim 50 miles from the nearest town with a dentist was a genuine crisis, the kind that could consume weeks and involve infection and fever and real danger. Frontier dentists, when they existed, practiced a form of dentistry that was essentially limited to extraction, performed with pliers and considerable force, and whatever whiskey could be managed on short notice. It was painful in a specific, memorable way that frontier memoirs describe with a vividness suggesting the experience made a lasting impression.
Common diseases killed with a thoroughness that modern readers can find difficult to fully absorb. Cholera,
which swept through wagon trains and frontier communities in epidemic waves during the 1840s and 1850s and continued to kill in the West through the later decades, could take a healthy person from first symptoms to death within a day. Typhoid fever, spread by contaminated water, was endemic in many areas where sanitation was inadequate, which described most of the frontier. Smallpox, diphtheria, and scarlet fever took children with a regularity that made death a constant presence in family life, rather than the exceptional event it is in the modern Western world. Women died in childbirth at rates that would now be considered unconscionable. The graves along the Oregon Trail, the markers and mounds, and sometimes just the bare, unmarked earth, tell this story quietly. Everything that defines the Old West, the open range, the cattle drives, the unbroken grassland stretching to the horizon, the fluid and improvised legal order, the enormous populations of wild animals, the sense that there was always more space ahead, all of it was temporary. It was a specific condition created by a specific set of circumstances, and when those circumstances changed, the world they had supported changed with them, and changed quickly. The single technological development that most directly ended the open range was the invention of a practical barbed wire by Joseph Glidden in 1873. Before barbed wire, fencing the plains was prohibitively expensive because timber was scarce and regular wire fencing was insufficient to contain cattle. Barbed wire was cheap to manufacture, easy to transport, and effective in a way that nothing before it had been. It spread across the West with remarkable speed, strung along property lines by ranchers and farmers who were determined to define what was theirs and keep other people's animals off it. By the mid-1880s, the open range that the cattle drives had depended on was divided and subdivided into parcels of private land, and the idea of walking a herd 800 miles through other people's property was no longer practical or legally defensible. The era of the great drives was over, not with a dramatic last stand, but with the quiet, relentless multiplication of wire. The winter of 1886 to 1887 delivered a final blow to the open range cattle industry. That winter was one of the most severe in recorded Great Plains history, a combination of a summer drought that had left the grass short and the cattle thin, followed by the worst blizzard season in memory. The losses were catastrophic. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 15 and 85% of the cattle on the northern plains died that winter, the specific number varying by region and by how exposed the animals were. Ranchers who had been wealthy in the fall of 1886 were ruined by the spring of 1887. The capital investors from the East who had poured money into the cattle boom of the early 1880s, lured by promises of extraordinary returns, absorbed losses that eliminated many of them from the industry entirely. The days of running enormous herds of cattle on open, unfenced grassland, depending on the range to feed them through the winter, were definitively over. The historian Frederick Jackson Turner
presented a paper in 1893 at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, in which he argued that the American frontier, as measured by a line of settlement that had been moving steadily westward since the European colonization of North America, had effectively closed. The Census Bureau had announced 2 years earlier that there was no longer a clearly identifiable frontier line in the United States. So thoroughly had the settlement of the West progressed. Turner argued that this closure was one of the most significant events in American history, that the frontier had been the defining force in the formation of American character, the source of the individualism and the democratic spirit, and the pragmatic energy that made Americans different from Europeans. The frontier was gone, and Americans would have to figure out who they were without it.
Turner's frontier thesis, as his argument became known, was immediately influential and has been debated ever since, complicated by later historians who pointed out correctly that his vision of the frontier as empty land waiting to be filled by industrious Anglo-American settlers erased the native peoples who were already there, and the African American and Hispanic and Asian workers whose labour built much of what the frontier became. The Chinese workers who drove the transcontinental railroad through the Sierra Nevada mountains were not part of Turner's frontier. The black cowboys who rode a quarter of the cattle drives were not part of his frontier. The Mexican vaqueros whose knowledge and techniques the entire cattle industry was built upon were not in his frontier. The women who homesteaded and farmed and taught school and ran businesses were barely present in it. His frontier was a selective myth, even as an academic argument, which is perhaps why it has endured so well. We are drawn to selective myths. They are easier to hold. The West had served as a pressure valve and a canvas and a promise, and its transformation into settled, fenced, organised territory changed the national imagination in ways that took decades to fully register. What followed the closing of the frontier was in many ways the creation of the Old West as myth. The people who had actually lived through the cattle drives and the homesteading and the range wars were still alive, and they watched with a mixture of pride and bewilderment as the experience they had simply been trying to survive was transformed into entertainment and legend. Buffalo Bill Cody, who had been a genuine frontier scout and Pony Express rider, organised his first Wild West show in 1883, taking the elements of frontier life and repackaging them as spectacular theatre. The shows toured the country and then Europe, presenting reenactments of buffalo hunts and Indian attacks and sharpshooting exhibitions to audiences who found the whole business enormously exciting. The audiences were watching a world that had already essentially ceased to exist, preserved in amber and lit with footlights and made safe and dramatic and clean of the ambiguities that had characterized the reality. The dime novels that had been pouring off Eastern presses since the 1860s, cheap paper-bound books with lurid covers and plots that bore a distant and selective relationship to actual Western life, had created a readership hungry for exactly the combination of adventure, freedom, and moral simplicity that the West appeared to offer. The hero was brave and virtuous, the villain was cowardly and corrupt, the landscape was grand, the gunfight resolved everything. It was a deeply satisfying formula, and it was almost entirely made up. And yet, beneath the myth, something real persisted. The Old West did produce genuine, extraordinary people, men and women of real courage and real resourcefulness, who did extraordinary things in difficult circumstances. The homesteaders who stayed and built communities in the face of everything the plains threw at them were not mythological figures. They were stubborn human beings making daily decisions to continue in the face of considerable evidence that stopping might be wise. The cowboys who rode the long trails were not heroes in the literary sense, but they were young men doing genuinely hard and dangerous work with skill and endurance that deserved acknowledgement. The native nations who resisted the loss of everything they had built over centuries, and who have continued to maintain their cultures and their identities through conditions that were specifically designed to destroy both of those things, were and are remarkable people whose story has been told too often from the outside. The legacy of the Old West is a strange and complicated thing, threaded through American culture so deeply that it is difficult to see it clearly. The imagery of wide-open spaces and individual freedom, the belief that a person can start fresh somewhere new and build something from nothing, the complicated relationship with guns and with violence as a potential solution to problems, the persistent mythology of the self-sufficient person who asks nothing of anyone and takes what they need from the land. All of these traces run through American life in ways that are both genuinely rooted in real history and genuinely distorted by the mythology that grew up around that history.
The truth, as always, was more complicated, more human, more difficult, and in its own quiet way, more worth knowing than the myth that replaced it. It was cold nights on the trail under enormous skies, and it was sod houses filling with mud when it rained, and it was the sound of cattle moving in the dark, and it was the specific loneliness of standing in a landscape so vast that the human figure simply disappears into it. It was real. It happened. People lived it, most of them without any expectation that anyone would ever write songs about it, or make movies about it, or remember it at all. They were just people, trying to stay warm and fed and alive in a world that was genuinely extraordinary, genuinely harsh, and genuinely irreversibly gone. And here, as the fire burns low and the great plains stretch out somewhere in the distance of your imagination, we let the last light of that world fade gently, not with a gunshot, not with a dramatic final showdown, but with the ordinary sounds of an ending, the wind in dry grass, the creak of a wagon wheel cooling in the night air, the faint smell of wood smoke drifting off across the dark. If these slow journeys through time help you find your way to rest, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know, and it keeps this quiet corner
corner of history open for everyone who needs it. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and whether you've already drifted off before the credits. And if you'd like to help this channel grow, your support is welcome and deeply appreciated. The West is behind us now.